Okay, we'll start the second part now, which has to do with what I've called here the personal discipline of the minister. Please remember my definition of a minister from the beginning. It's very important that you don't get into your minds the idea that I'm talking about parsons or anything like that. So, this is, go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and he then says this in verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things, and they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So that's the passage I want to look at. We're talking now about the personal discipline of a minister. And you've got a sort of a testimony that comes out through this. And it starts off with this illustration, this metaphor that Paul uses when he says, do you not know that all those who run in a race, they all run, but only one receives the prize? The original Olympic Games, different to the modern Olympic Games, only had one prize. That's to say, every event had one prize. You just had an olive crown that officially was taken from an olive tree that Hercules was supposed to have planted like this, I think, originally. So the point I'm making is there was no silver and there was no bronze. There was just one award with every event. You got the prize. There was just one prize. And Paul is using this illustration now, this metaphor, and he says they all run, but only one receives the prize. And he uses words here that are sort of subtle, and I've sort of tried to think of a way of actually expressing this in English. But can you see in verse 24, he uses the word receives, but one receives the prize. Now I'm going to bore you with a little bit of Greek, just so that you can hear the sound of what I'm saying. In Greek, that is the Greek word lambano, which really means to take something, to actively take something. Then he says, you run in such a way that you may, and here it says, obtain it. That's not lambano, that's kata lambano. And kata intensifies it. So you've got something like this. Don't you know that all those who run in a race all run, but one takes the prize? You run in such a way that you take hold of it. You can see I'm kind of putting some teeth into this thing. There's more energy in this second word. So there's and energy is going to be something which will be important in what we've got to say here. So this isn't Paul being a kind of a passive pietist, someone who is kind of just sitting back and saying, well, if God wants it, he'll do it, and I'm here, he can come and get me if he wants me. You'll see that Paul begins now to speak about his own sense of calling, his own sense of stewardship, this accountability that he has, and because he feels this responsibility, he has lived his life on the edge all the time. He's lived it absolutely. This is extreme Christianity, because this is the way he sees it. When Paul writes to the Romans, you'll know this, he uses this language, and he says that I'm a debtor to the Jews, to the Greeks, and to the barbarians. And you say, well, how could Paul end up being a debtor to the Greeks and the barbarians? And it comes back to this sense of being a trustee. You see, a trustee has things put into their care, and they have to administer these things for somebody else's benefit. And then they have to give an account to the person who gave things. The trustee owns nothing. All that they have is responsibility and accountability. This is why it's such an onerous kind of task. So the reason that Paul says that he is in debt to the Greeks and the barbarians is because he is a trustee. and he has been put in trust with the gospel, which is not for his benefit. It's not so that he can become rich and fat and sleek with it. It's so that others can. And because of that, on the accounts, if you actually had on accounts, something that's given to you but you actually are holding it for somebody else is actually not part of your assets, it's part of your liabilities. So I hope that doesn't confuse people. But it's what it means is this, is that Paul is in debt because he's holding something that actually isn't his. And he's in debt until he discharges this debt. And this is the whole thrust about this idea of stewardship. That a man or a woman who have this calling, this sense of God having put something into their hands, they are in debt. You know, he says, woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. The love of Christ constrains me. And you could quote a dozen different texts where Paul says this. And there's this, I don't want to call it a driving force because Paul wasn't driven. He was making these choices himself. But there was a tremendous sense of responsibility that was upon him. He knew that God had given him something to do, and he knew that he was going to have to give an account for this, and so he lived his life on the edge. And this is what he says. He says, this is how you are to live. You're to live like an Olympic runner runs his race. You're to put absolutely everything into it. You're to save no contingencies for what happens tomorrow. You save no energy for what happens tomorrow. You don't consider tomorrow. You go before the wind, and you let the wind take you, and you just live your life like this. And this is this man, of whom he says himself, he says, I'm happy, he says, to spend and be spent. That's Paul. All these apostles were like this. I really do believe that this spirit is in every man or woman to whom God gives some kind of huperetos or stewardship role like this. That there is a compelling sense of responsibility. Not that they are afraid of, not that they're afraid of God in any sense, but just that there's just this overwhelming sense that God has given them something to do and they must do it. They must do it. There's no rest for them until they've done this thing that God has given them to do. They're in debt until they've discharged their responsibility. So he says, you run in such a way that you may obtain it. And then he says this, everyone who competes. I'm a bit sorry that the New King James, like lots of other versions, has gone for the word compete. Because Paul isn't really making the point about competition here. He's actually making the point about the energies that he pours into this. This word competes. I think the Old King James Version will say strive or something like that. It's the word that we get agonize from. It's agonizo. But the word agonize in Greek, it's the word that is associated with athletic endeavor. It's the word which speaks of someone who is absolutely, as we would say, focused. Absolutely focused to do this thing. The rest of the world does not exist until he has done this thing that he's determined to do. I don't know whether any of you will remember, but maybe, I guess it's maybe kind of 12 or 16 years ago now, Linford Christie won the 100 metres sprint. And there's television coverage of him in this sprint, and he's heading for the line. And the television focuses on his face, and it's frightening to see the intensity in this man. It's as though everything is drained from him and all the energy has gone into his legs. He's hardly breathing. He doesn't blink. In 100 yards, he doesn't blink. It's just this absolute focus. He's driving to this point. And this is really the Greek word agonizo, which really means to strive with everything that you've got. And that's the word here. It isn't, competition is comparing you with somebody else. That isn't the essence that's coming through in this. This isn't Paul saying, I want to be better than somebody else. That's not it at all. This is Paul striving with everything that's in him. The whole of his life, without any exception, is focused in running this race, in getting to the finishing line and doing this thing that God has given you to do. But then he says here, you won't see this in your New King James, but it's there in the Old King James. He says this earlier on. He says, run in such a way that you may obtain it. That you, that's verse 24, that you is plural. So he isn't just speaking thou, he isn't speaking to just an individual, he's speaking to all the people who are at Corinth. So there is a sense, there's another sense in which all of us have a race to run. And we're expected to live, this is extreme Christianity. You know, they have these things called extreme sport. And so did someone use the phrase the other day, extreme church? And I'm an extremist, so I like the word extreme. But this is extreme ministry. This is extreme stewardship. This is extreme under-rowingness. This is a man who, just like Linford Christie, actually the other competitors didn't exist. The world didn't exist. The only thing that exists was that point that he was getting to. And this is Paul. He's absolutely determined to do this thing. And he says, you're to run like this. Now, this isn't the kind of thing we often preach, because you might say, well, doesn't this make people kind of very intense, and isn't this where fanaticism comes? I don't believe Paul was a fanatic. But I do believe he was absolutely single-minded. I do believe everything had to serve this one central purpose of his life, that he was to fulfill this ministry that God had given to him. And you know his testimony when he was before Festus and when he was before Felix. And he says, God gave him this commission, and he says, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. In other words, he did the thing that he was given to do. So this is a word that speaks of intense. The emphasis is upon effort, not upon pain. Agonize, our English word agonize has kind of changed. It now means the concentration is on the pain. But originally the concentration was upon this absolute intense. I hope there's only not too many people here who will kind of hear this first time round. But when I see this, if there was another metaphor that comes to mind, it's actually childbirth, where it comes to a point where a woman's whole body, her whole mind, her lungs, her heart, every single part of her has one thing in mind, and only one, and it's to bring this child to birth. And it's this absolute concentration of energy that Paul is focusing on here. So he says, everyone who competes for the prize is temperate. That's to say, he's self-disciplined in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown. That's the olive crown. But we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. This is not a ramble he's on. It isn't a kind of a nice gentle cruise. He runs with absolute certainty that I fight not as one who beats the air. And then he says, I discipline my body. And he uses very interesting language here, because he uses a word which is used in the story of the unjust judge in the Gospels, where that man, if you remember, he didn't want to take any notice of the widow, but in the end he says, she wearies me, I'll give her what she wants. And maybe you know that the word literally means to give somebody a black eye. It means it comes from boxing, and it has to do with a kind of a, if you like, a consistent kind of barrage of blows on someone that actually leaves people with black and blue. And this is the language that Paul uses here. And he says, he isn't talking about physically beating his body. That's what mystics and Roman Catholicism kind of went into, with kind of flagellation and self-harm and this kind of things. But what he's talking about is this is a process. He puts his body under a rigid regime in order to make a point to his body, and this is the point he wants to make. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, because the body is a terrible master, but can be a wonderful servant. This is what the Greeks didn't understand. They thought bodies were always terrible masters, and they used to look to the time when the body was no more so they could be released to be what they were really intended to be. You can be what you were really intended to be in your body. That's why God gave you a body. But your body has to be the servant. And the trouble is that our body, in a sense, kind of has a memory. And it has a memory of the fact that for many of us, for good parts of our life, it has been the master. And when we were hungry, we ate. And when we were tired, we slept. And if we wanted other forms of gratification, we just took them. And the body has a memory. There's a lovely line in one of Wesley's hymns which says, "Thine image can harbour no relics of sin." And it's almost as though that there's a kind of a transient, lingering memory somehow in our body. And our body wants its own way. It wants the easy way. It wants peace and quiet. And what Paul is saying is actually, no, you can't do this. I'll say just one thing. Are we all right for it? Okay. I'm just talking about the time. I want to make a practical point here. And I don't want to make these kind of hard, intense legislations. But I just want to make this point that if you say yes to your body in its demands in one area of life, you give it an inch, it'll take a yard somewhere else. It will presume that because you've said yes at that point, that it's back in control again. So if you are lazy and you stay in bed longer than you should do, you'll probably find that you're overeating, and you'll probably find that aspects of other areas of your life, maybe in things like sexual gratification, aren't in order either. They're not in control either. There's a pattern here that these things are all sort of linked together. And our body was created to be the servant of our spirits. And part of the redemption, part of the salvation that God is working out, is to bring it back into that pattern again. And this is what Paul is saying. And he's using really strong language. And he's saying, well, this is how I live my life. I live it on full stretch. I live it absolutely with nothing left in reserve. I live it with a single focus. This is how I live, because this is the only way I win the prize. And he isn't the only one who kind of talks about that. And he talks about this perishable crown. Crowns aren't automatically given to Christians. Crowns, if you follow through the scriptures, you'll see that they are given ultimately because people have been faithful in that God has trusted to them. And God will trust something to each one of us in one area or another. And if you're faithful in that, He'll trust some more to you. And if you're faithful in that, He'll trust some more to you. And He will go on doing this. And you will have a crown which in some way is related to the responsibility He gave to you and your stewardship of it. And if you remember this little passage at the end, let me read a couple of verses if we've got the time. This is 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. And now he's talking to elders, and he calls himself a co-elder. Never quite sure how that must have worked out. Whether by the time he wrote this he was settled in a church or what, I don't know. But chapter 5 and verse 1 says this: "The elders who are among you I exhort, who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed." And then he says this, very important language here, not just for elders, but actually for all stewardship responsibility that God gives to men and women. "Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being ensamples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away." Can you see how the promise of the crown is linked to faithful care of others? In other words, it's linked to people fulfilling their God-given stewardship responsibilities. And if you turn to if you turn to Revelation chapter 3, you'll see how this language comes through again. Revelation chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. This is to Yes, to the church at Philadelphia, which begins at verse 7, but I'm going to read from verse 10. Because you have kept my commandment to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which will come upon the whole earth, to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. There's a danger, apparently, that we could lose our crown, that we would not be faithful stewards of that God has given to us, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. So we'll pause now before we come on to the next bit.